Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lisette Coley, and I serve as the Executive Director of Parapsychology Foundation. And I have the pleasure today to be within the Eileen J. Garrett Research Library with Parapsychology Foundation staff member Nancy Zingrone. So welcome, Nancy. We're going to have a little talk.
Thank you.
Right? So why don't we start off, I know, but for the viewers, what is your present affiliation?
My present affiliation, I'm the Director of Publications here at the Foundation, and I'm the Executive Editor of the International Journal of Parapsychology.
Right. So why don't you fill us in a little bit about your educational background as to how you...
My undergraduate degree is from Mundelein College in in Chicago, which no longer exists. It's now part of Loyola University. And that's only important because John Bisaha, who was a parapsychologist in the 70s, was a faculty member at Mundelein College. And I did my psychology work with him and took parapsychology courses as part of my undergraduate psychology major, which was pretty unusual at the time. Brenda Dunn, who's the laboratory manager at the Pear Lab at Princeton University, was in the same classes as I was. The two of us both got our degrees in psychology with John Bisaha at Mundelein College.
So it was a very unique period of time,
Very
right?
unique, yeah.
This is not...
Yeah, pretty unusual. And I did a master's degree, a Master's of Science in Education at Northern Illinois University sometime later, and actually managed to work parapsychology into half of my psych courses and some of my education courses. So I got quite a bit of experience, especially doing experiments for human information processing and some of the other courses that I took.
Well, that's not easy to do, right?
No,
Nancy, did you catch a lot of flack for that?
Yeah,
I mean,
the
how did you
education
finesse
department was very, very positive about it. So they were constantly kind of coming up with things like, "Oh, how about if you do something on parapsychology for this class?" You know, the
because
professors
of why?
were
They think it
supportive.
was an intellectual...
They were interested. They were interested. There was a faculty member who I didn't actually know in the psych department at the time by the name of Tom Roberts, who was interested in transpersonal psych. And I think he kind of, all of his colleagues were very open to it. So the people that I did take were, you know, they knew that I was the one that was interested, and so then they would come with that when it was time to decide what we would do. In the psych department, they were universally negative, but...
is that a common thing?
Yeah, that's pretty usual. Yeah. They were very negative. But I had a number of experimental psych profs there who were at least positive enough that they would let me do experiments. And I noticed that if I didn't get significant results, I would get A's, and if I got significant results, I'd get B's. But it was good because I got a lot of experience there. And then I took, while I was doing my master's, one course at Northeastern Illinois University in parapsychology with a faculty member who was there at that time. And later, when I got my MS Ed, I went back and became an adjunct faculty member at Northeastern. Largely because of John Bisaha. He had been hired to teach a course and didn't have the time and recommended me, and I ended up teaching there for 3 or 4 years, both statistics and parapsychology.
That's something else.
And then from there, I went to Duke University. I had this idea that I wanted to do history of science, and that I didn't want to stay in psychology, and partly was because I was on the staff of the Rhine Research Center, which was then across the street from Duke's campus, and we had a lot of contact with Cy Moskoff in the history department there. And I matriculated there in 1986 and was there for 7 years, the bulk of which was pretty wonderful, doing history of science, history of medicine, American social history of women, and then taking some courses in the psychology department, which was, again, universally negative about parapsychology, and I was always identified as the parapsychologist that had snuck into the room somehow. Although there was one faculty member there, Greg Lockwood, who was socially positive while being intellectually negative, and that was kind of a good combination because you could talk to him about the research.
At least the door was open somewhat.
Yeah, Greg Lockhead, actually. And then we left, Carlos Alvarado and I were both there together, and we left I left in 1993 in January, and he left in 92, and it was just this gradual realization that we needed to be back in parapsychology, and the opportunities opened up at University of Edinburgh. So I matriculated there in 1994, which was 150 years ago, and half of the time that I was there, I'm still there, I was on leave. So I'm now coming up against my final deadline for the submission of my PhD thesis.
So this is the big writing up period.
This is the big writing up period. And the thing about this thesis is, because I had so much instructional time in the histories of science and medicine, and got around the edges a little bit of sociology of science. My PhD thesis at Edinburgh is very heavily history and sociology of science, as well as being psychology and parapsychology. So that was kind of how all that tied together.
Well, what actually drew you to parapsychology?
I had, as a kid, I was very interested in it. The Irish side of the family had a lot of tales. The Italian side of the family had a lot of tales. It was ghosts and dreams and common precognitive dreams, that kind of stuff. There were stories about those kinds of things in the family. So the family was pretty open to the idea. My mother and my father brought us all up to be as individual as possible and not to pay any attention to what conventional wisdom said about what you can and can't believe.
Right?
Yeah, they were both very independent thinkers, both of them. So that was part of it. And then the actual sort of starting point was in grade school. I had a good girlfriend who had a lot of precognitive experiences and apparitional experiences and all this kind of stuff. And there were 4 of us in this group of girls that had kind of come together because of the Beatles and not because of parapsychology. And I was the one, we were all in different grades, which was kind of unusual. And I was the one that that went to the library all the time, partly because I lived in the country and I had to wait for my mother to pick me up, and partly because I had a big interest. And for some unknown reason, in the library, I come from a town that then had 3,000 people in northern Illinois, in a rural area. The library had at least 25 books on parapsychology, the bulk of them scientific stuff, like Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, all of the Rhine's books, including Louisa Rhine's Hidden Channels, Gaither Pratt's autobiography.
Usually the case.
No,
correct?
and now they don't. Now they look like every little library in the world. They have Richard Broughton's Controversial Science, and then they have a couple of ghost books, and
all that
that's the
background.
ballgame.
Really?
Yeah, but at the time it was a great collection, and so instead of having the Hans Holzer types books, which I would buy in the book rack at the pharmacy, I really had some good books in that library, so I would read through the books and come back and report to my little crowd of what happens and what doesn't happen and who are the researchers and who aren't and all that kind of stuff, and I got really interested. And I did a lot of reading through high school and wrote a lot of papers, and then when I was 18 decided, now I'm an adult, so I'm not doing this anymore. And I gave away all my books, which I regret.
Nancy.
Yeah. And got rid of all my papers and all that stuff and went off to college expecting to be, at that time, actually a journalist.
So you'd given up the ghost.
Yeah, given up the ghost. Yeah, it's like, no, that's
parapsychology.
what teenagers do. I'm not doing that. And went to college, took side by side, because of the requirements, psychology courses and literature courses, and with the exception of a couple of faculty members in the English department at the time, couldn't stand the literature and journalism courses, and just went bananas over the psychology stuff, so changed my major. And then Bisa Ha was offering Intro to Parapsychology, and I thought, well, that's an easy A. I've read all this stuff, so I took the course, and that was it. I was hooked again. Yeah, I wrote Rhine a little letter.
Did you really? Did you get a response?
Well, I wrote, actually, Carl Alvarado and I found out some years later that we actually wrote Rhine within about 4 weeks of each other the same summer.
So
he was 17 and I was 21. I was a junior. And I wrote him, asked him for his advice. He told me not to do parapsychology until I had my PhD, which I ignored. He told me to be a biologist because that was a more fruitful area to get into if you wanted to be parapsychology. I ignored that too. Told me to do a lot of reading on my own and to take every opportunity I could find to do a paper or a project on parapsychology in my other academic classes. And that I paid attention to. And for a long time I had his letter framed. And I wrote here. I spent $91 on, got in big trouble because I spent $91 and almost didn't make the
Well,
rent
years
that
ago,
month.
$91 was a considerable
This is
amount.
1972, remember, and my
Uh-huh.
rent, I think, at the time was like 175 or something like that. And I almost didn't make it because I sent you guys $91 for monographs and a subscription to Parapsych Review and all that kind of stuff. So I spent that summer kind of collecting all these sort of talismans of becoming a professional, like subscriptions to the various journals and books that I thought were important and all,
But at the
all
same
that
time,
kind of
Nancy,
thing.
you were actually on the front lines teaching? Because at
I
this
didn't start
point-
to teach until after my master's degree, which was in 1979. I got the degree in 77, and I taught adult ed courses in 78. And I started teaching at Northeastern in the fall of 1979, so that was a little bit later. So I didn't actually teach courses for credit until after I had my MS Ed. So, but before that, I did some adult ed stuff, including in 1974, I found, through this course at Northeastern, there was a little group that no longer exists outside of Chicago called the Illinois Center for, at that time, Psychical Research. They later changed their names to Parapsychological Research. And through them, I taught adult ed courses when I was 23, 24 years old in these very scary situations in public libraries with everybody being 55, you know, me standing up there with my
The little
hair.
ingenue, yeah.
Well, you know, that kind of thing. Gave me a lot of good experience because I had to pull together lectures and stuff. But I
you've
didn't
got-
really do a whole course until 1979. So, and that was an interesting experience in the sense that it was an academic course. It was a 200 level. They had to have had introductory courses in psychology. And I taught it the same way that John Bisaha taught it. So it was very, very heavily focused on the experimental research. People had to do experiments.
Really?
Yeah, and some of the people who later formed the nucleus of the Midwest Center for Psi Research, which I was a founder of and then the director of education of and then the executive director of before I left Chicago, they came out of that first class. They were my students, and then some of the other people that joined that group were John Bisaha's students. And in fact, Brenda Dunn and John Bisaha and I were among the group that founded that organization. And they were alive, I think, until 85, 86, something like that, from 77.
Well, I know the foundation is the happy recipient of a lot of your expertise in teaching because you do probably the bulk of the faculty teaching along with Dr. Alvarado within the foundation's Lyceum. But for many years you participated at the Rhine Research Center
Yeah, I
summer
was on
studies.
staff formally from 1982. That's when I left Chicago. I was on staff from December of 1982 formally until December of 1985. And then I was what's known as a visiting scholar from 1986 until 1993. And when I was hired in 1982, I was unusual in the sense that I hadn't taken the summer study program, which started in 1974. And actually, I had had a couple of opportunities to get in there in 74, 76, 77, but it was a period in my life when I didn't want to be away from Chicago for such a long time period, so I didn't go. So when I was hired, I was told by Dr. Rao that you are hired as a research associate, but you will take the summer program next summer because we've never hired somebody at your
Who has
level
not.
who hasn't done this. So the first year in 83, I was a student just like everybody else. And in 84, I think I taught a couple of lectures. In 85, I took over as the coordinator of the program.
You don't
And
need to waste any time, Nancy.
No.
Okay.
In 86, they brought in John Palmer, who's definitely higher up than I am in terms of curriculum development and stuff, and he took over the program as a whole, and then I started to become one of the general main faculty members. And the thing that had happened with that is when the summer study program was started in 1974, it was basically a lot of people come in the summertime and they visit, so let's charge kids $400 or whatever to come in and hang around. And if we can get any of these people to talk about what they do, that will constitute their summer experience. Rhine had run some informal summer institutes in the 50s and the 60s, so this was kind of an outgrowth of that. In 77, when Deborah Weiner, who's our statistical editor of the IJP, was hired out of a summer program as a research fellow, she kind of systematized the curriculum in the sense that she would sort of figure out who should be together in a cluster and made it a little more formal and set up some more formal activities. When I came in, I overhauled it in terms of modules because I'd had some education and curriculum development and had done that at Mundelein in terms of our adult ed
So
program.
you sort of solidified and tightened.
Yeah, and set up sections and decided when, and started asking people, because there had been a mythology that you couldn't ask people to come on a particular day and a particular time and to talk about a particular something, because the Rhine Center had never been able to compensate people for their time. And everybody was delighted. So when John came in, he had had a lot of curriculum experience in parapsychology at Kennedy, John F. Kennedy University, and he tweaked it further, and now it's a very formal program that runs 8 weeks. And so teaching there was always a very important experience, because it required you really could not do what a lot of faculty people do in normal universities. You couldn't write a lecture the first year you got hired and then teach it for the rest of your life. You really had to make sure, because this was the kind of the center, the only educational opportunity
That you were
of that
presenting.
kind, that you were up to date. And then there would be, there was a great deal of attention paid to the evaluation of the course at the end. We would, that was something I instituted, where we would spend an entire afternoon with the students on the last day of the program saying, okay, what was wrong, what was right, what should we be doing?
Be able to build and finesse.
Yeah, and the one thing the RRC staff has always done very well is to respond to that kind of feedback, and so the program was always evolving and always taking a new shape, and it was really a dynamic experience if you're a teacher. You know.
So you feel a well-deserved sense of pride that you did your bit for that very valuable program, which
I
continues
went back
today.
in 2000 and taught as well, and I think it's a very important. There's no, when I was coming up, there was nothing. I mean, to have John Visa at Mundelein was a miracle, you know. So
So he would be somewhat the role of a mentor at that point.
yeah, he was. Yeah,
Yes.
he was a mentor for me and for Brenda. He used to tell. He left the field and went into public health administration. And he used to tell people that Brenda and I were his contributions to parapsychology. So
I think he's probably right.
yeah,
Tell me, Nancy. I know that in your other life, apart from parapsychology, although you've managed to meld them, you had a lot of publishing experience, which of course comes to the fore. And again, the Foundation's very happy recipient that you're the Director of Publications and the Executive Editor of IJP. But where would you say your heart is within parapsychology, research-wise, or what would you somewhat be known for?
well, I'm kind of not. Well, I don't know what I'm known for really. I mean, I have three main interests, and they're publishing, education, and then research. And in research, when I started at the Rhine Center, I was the first person to direct the Gonsfeld research that was done there. And I did 2 studies, and then the team took it over. The team I put together then went on, because then I was no longer a full-time staff member. So I did Gonsfeld at the beginning. I did some research in those days. If you were a research associate at the RRC, you had to kind of find your own way. There was no formal thing, and you weren't an assistant to somebody. You basically got given an office, and Dr. Rao would say...
So you really self-started?
Yeah,
I mean,
Dr. Rao would say, develop a research program. I want to see in a year that you've got something cohesive happening. And it was a really unusual situation for somebody who was young and not tried and not a PhD.
Yeah, that tabula rasa that just
and
go
we
out
all
there.
got that. We all got that opportunity. So I did Gonsfeld. I did. There was already interest in the place in doing a more formal kind of set of studies, and Debbie Weiner and I went up and did some interning with Chuck Honorton at the Psychophysical Research Labs in Princeton. Debbie was very much interested in something called the observational theories, which is a physics theory, and I do not claim to understand
Good, because I'm
what the heck that really is. And it's interesting because there are a number of people who tell me that set of experiments that we did were extremely important, and I contributed not the theory but the methodology and the procedural stuff, and I did most of the data gathering for that. So there were 2 observational theory papers. Once I met Carlos, I did a number of historical things, some quantitative, some qualitative. And then since he and I have collaborated, we focus more on the psychology of the psychic, specifically people who either score well in the experimental situation or have particular types of experiences like the out-of-body experience. And I think that's where my research interest is now, is in the psychology of people who do well in experiments and who claim to have psychic experiences in life. But because most of my life is education and publishing, I don't get a lot of time to actually do any research anymore. But that's really what I'm interested in. And my next presidential address that I give for the Parapsychological Association, that's what I'm going to focus on, is the psychology of the psychic.
Yeah, I should interject that you've already served as the PA president in 2001, which happened to be our PF's 50th anniversary, and you're the president-elect that will be serving, what, in 2003?
From the end of the, 2002 to 2003, from the end of the convention
this August.
Actually, 2003 to 2004, from the end of the, Carlos is now the president, from the end of the next convention until the end of the convention in Vienna in 2004, I'll be the president. So I'll be giving my second presidential address in Vienna. That's not too bad, New York City and Vienna.
No, not so shabby.
Yeah.
Not so shabby. Well, tell me, Nancy, with your perspective, I mean, you've obviously paid your dues through parapsychology, and you've come up through the ranks, and you're at the top of your profession. What do you think about the state of parapsychological research in general?
In terms of the productivity of it, given the lack of funding and the lack of institutional venues to carry out the research, the lack of researchers, I think we're doing really well. We've been around since 1882, which is 120 years. Sibyl Schouten, who's a Dutch psychologist, once said, and he said this in 1982, so that was the first 100 years, that the first 100 years of labor and money spent on psychical research and experimental parapsychology was equivalent to 2 months of labor and money spent on experimental psychology in the United States.
2 months?
2 months. And I figured out one day when I was half asleep and couldn't think of anything else to do to keep my mind awake, that since 1982 we've probably added 2 more days to that. So considering we haven't hit 3 months yet in terms of American funding and labor, I think we're doing pretty well. I think there's a lot of solid findings, and there's a lot of programmatic research. There's still a lot of stuff going on that are one-shot type experiments, but there's so much to do that the few people that do have time to do research, it's difficult to focus on one area because there's really so much to do. So I think in that sense we've done very well. In terms of professionalizing and having the funding and the opportunities and the educational venues and all that stuff expanding in the way a normal science would, we have done very abysmally. We look nothing like other sciences that have had 120 years of history. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that, most of which I think have to do with the phenomena itself and the fact that the scientific worldview, in the West at least, is very dismissive of a lot of these experiences. In the United States since the 70s, we've had a very organized skeptical set of organizations, skeptical movement that does everything it can to make sure that people who get into the field in a positive way are not employable in conventional academic and scientific positions. They make sure the funding goes elsewhere. They make sure the climate is one in which it is socially and academically dangerous to say that you're even interested in reporting psychic experiences. So even if you have one of these sort of conservative, sanitized views of what you're doing is, I don't care if the phenomena is real, I'm just interested in who the people are who report it, there's still an enormous amount of animosity.
So there is a risk, definitely.
Yeah, my career is evidence of that. To try and go back now and get a conventional academic job, I wouldn't even be, not only am I too old, obviously, but I wouldn't be even looked at because I have this CV that's full of academic publications in parapsychology, even though quite a number of them are in conventional journals like Imagination, Cognition, and Personality or the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation. There's still it's still parapsychology. No way that you look at it. The big difference in the world now is that Professor Morris, Robert Morris at the University of Edinburgh, has, by stint of I don't know what, personality and the willingness to go anywhere and give a talk.
And his great diplomatic skills,
unbelievable diplomatic skills. He'll give a talk to anybody, anywhere, at any time. over the 15 years that he's been running the program at the University of Edinburgh, and the groundwork for the acceptance of that program was laid by John Beloff and his students, Richard Broughton and some others.
Within the university?
Within the university. What Bob Morris has managed to do in the UK is make the study of the paranormal a legitimate one, and it can be approached from a skeptical point of view or a proponent point of view, as he likes to call it, somebody who's positive about the experiences and thinks they might be real. And there are a number of universities there now that are cranking out graduate students teaching undergraduate modules in parapsychology. If you take I can't remember if it's the O level or your higher, but it's a certain set of tests that you take to get into college. One of the social science modules that you can choose to take on that test now is parapsychology.
Which is incredible.
Which is
feat,
unbelievable.
Right? It's never been.
Yeah, so the whole social situation and potential for further professionalization in the UK is very different than it is in the United States. And the thing about parapsychology is we need that professionalization. We need to have not 50 full-time researchers on the planet, but thousands and thousands of people working. You know, we need people willing to talk about it, willing to see how their research has a relationship to our research, that kind of thing. And in the United States, that hasn't happened. In fact, we seem to have
dwindled.
we've turned the clock back. Because if you look at the way it was in the 70s, Rex Stanford was at St. John's. You could work with him. Gertrude Schmeidler was cranking out graduate students here in New York. You could go work with Charlie Tart at UC Davis. You could go work at Stanley Krippner, wherever he happened to be.
So there were chairs at the table.
There were lots of places to go. And Mind Science research was still live in San Antonio, Texas, and the Rhine Center. The ASPR was still doing research here in New York. Psychophysical research labs existed, so there were all kinds of opportunities, and there were a lot more people around. Duke at that time, there was an engineering group inside of Duke University's engineering department that were doing parapsychology research. So there were a lot of places around the country that you could get training, you could do research, you might be able to even get a job. You know, there were actually two independent, self-sufficient research organizations in Durham at the time, the Technical Research Foundation and
was Bill Rolls.
And Bill Rolls Group, and then the Rhine Center. And now it has dwindled down to the point that if a student asks me where they can go in the United States, I tell them Sabre Graduate Institute in San Francisco, the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology in California. If they want to do a minor as an undergraduate, they can go to Franklin Pierce College in Rindge, New Hampshire, and beyond that, forget about it. You have to find an individual person who's willing to allow you to do something that has something to do with parapsychology in this country. So whenever I get an email from somebody from Australia or Canada, I'm just delighted because they're Commonwealth citizens and they can go to the UK. Or if I get it from somebody in Europe that speaks English, they're European Union citizens and they can go to the UK.
Well, then it's safe to say that if someone would like to give some money to the foundation to endow a chair and start this up again, we'd be more than overjoyed.
We are in desperate need in the United States of getting back our position.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed today's selection. My name is Lisette Coley and I serve as president of Parapsychology Foundation. I hope you give us a like, and if you have a comment, then do so below and we'll try and better serve you. Any suggestions are welcome. And we want to thank very much our loyal subscribers. This is a relatively new channel and a new venture for Parapsychology Foundation, so we very much appreciate your loyalty. And if you haven't decided to subscribe, maybe pretty please you could.